In this lesson, we're going to look at one motherboard that is brand new and another one that's about 4 years old, so you'll be familiar with the different components on each type. The heart of any motherboard is actually a component that most people don't even think about, but it's what makes a motherboard work, and those are the traces that connect different components together. One of the key roles of the traces that we saw on the bottom side of the motherboard is to connect our CPU, you can see the CPU socket here, with the other different devices that are installed on the motherboard. Now we also have, in addition to our CPU socket, we have our memory connectors right here. These are the slots into which we install our system memory. We also have a series of expansion slots. Now these slots are used for inserting expansion boards that allow us to customize what our system does. We also have a connector down here that we use to connect our floppy disk drive to the motherboard. And we also have two connectors here that we use to connect IDE devices to our motherboard. Now, in addition to IDE support, this particular motherboard has serial ATA interfaces built in as well. We have 4 of them right here. Most newer motherboards additionally have USB built into the motherboard itself. You can see right here we have 3 different USB connectors. These are used to connect USB devices such as the front panel USB connector or USB connectors that are installed in an empty expansion slot cover back in the back. These are included in addition to the built-in USB connectors that are connected back here on the faceplate. We also have our BIOS and CMOS chip right here. Now on older systems, these were 2 separate chips. We had our BIOS chip and our CMOS chip. On a modern system such as this, they're all combined into a single chip. We also have our battery over here that powers our CMOS. Make sure we don't lose our settings that we configure. In addition to our BIOS, we also have our chipset. Now, remember that the chipset is composed of the North Bridge and the South Bridge chipsets. On older systems, these were usually implemented as 2 separate chips. On a newer system, however, you might find both the North Bridge and the South Bridge incorporated into a single chip. Now, on this system, that single chip is beneath this fan. The chipset gets hot, so this particular system has implemented a fan to keep it cool. So in addition to our disk drive connectors and our memory and our expansion slots and our USB and our CPU, we also have various types of other connectors that are used for a variety of different purposes. Now some late model motherboards, because of the CPU requirements, will have an additional power connector, and it's a square 4-prong connector that you can see right here. Not all do that though. Many will just use the power connector down here. When you're buying a motherboard and mating it up with a case and power supply, you need to make sure that you choose the correct combination. If your motherboard requires this extra 4-pin connector, then you need to make sure that the power supply you purchase has that same 4-pin connector. Otherwise, the system won't work. Older motherboards used to use a lot of jumpers in order to configure various parameters of the board. For example, if we wanted to set the bus speed, we would put a shunt on a particular jumper on the motherboard. Today, we don't see that many jumpers on motherboards. Most of the configuration is handled through the CMOS setup program. However, there still are a few around. For example, on this motherboard, there's a series of jumpers right here, and these are used to configure, on this particular motherboard, the audio interface. Now, this brings up a very important point. Notice on this set of jumpers that it has a label over here. It says J-OD1. This tells you what the function of this particular set of jumpers is. If you go to your documentation, you can look up and find out what J-OD1 does. That's really helpful, especially on a very complex motherboard where there may be lots of jumpers or lots of different connectors. Many times you may not know exactly what those things are. You can find out by looking at the label and then checking the documentation. Notice also that this PCI slot is labeled PCI 4, this one's labeled PCI 3, this one's labeled PCI 2, and this one's labeled PCI 1. Again, that provides you a good clue as to what the particular slot is, and you can use that label to look up in the documentation and find out specifics. Now we also have our CD audio connector here. What we do is connect this connector with a cable up to our CD or DVD drive and connect it to the audio out. This allows us to play audio CDs in our drive, have the signal for the sound to come down to the motherboard and be processed and handled by our audio board. We also need to look at the various connectors that are integrated into this motherboard. Now, back in the old days, we didn't have all this stuff integrated onto the board. About 10 years ago, the only thing you saw integrated into the motherboard was the keyboard connector. If you wanted to use a mouse, you had to install a serial port card. If you wanted to print, then you needed to install a card that had some kind of parallel port. Usually, the cards we installed had both a parallel port and a serial port integrated. If you wanted USB, you had to install a USB card. Same with audio, same with network interface. Well, because most folks wanted all that stuff, motherboard manufacturers began integrating everything in on the motherboard itself. Over here we have our mouse and keyboard connectors. We have our serial port. We have our parallel port. We have our USB connectors, our network interface, more USB connectors, our audio, and our SDPIF connector as well. In this lesson, we looked at the various components that comprise a typical motherboard. We looked at expansion slots. We looked at CPU sockets, memory sockets, and IDE and floppy disk connectors.